My daughter-in-law looked me right in the face, in the middle of a crowded restaurant, and said, "If you can't handle my mother's jokes, you're welcome to pay the check and go home." The whole table went quiet. Her mother was sitting right beside her. My son was sitting across from me. People at the next table started turning to look. I just smiled. I didn't get angry. I didn't say a single unkind word. I raised my hand and called the server over. "Put the entire table on my card, please." My daughter-in-law actually relaxed. She smiled. She thought I was about to do what I'd done for 9 straight years. Swallow it, pay for it, and pretend nothing happened. But not this time. I signed the receipt, put the card back in my wallet, stood up, and got my coat. Then I looked at my son. "Colin, I'm heading home. You two will need to find your own way back." He looked at me like he'd misheard. I didn't explain. I didn't look back. I walked out of that restaurant alone. But that was only the first night. The next morning, they found out something. Their whole world started coming apart the moment I got up from that table. My name is Bernadette Thibodeau. Everybody's called me Bern since I was in school. I'm 68 now, and I live in Portland, Maine, out past Back Cove. For 35 years, I ran the business side of a lobster operation. My husband Alcide and his brother fished it. I did everything else. Licenses, trap tags, payroll, the co-op paperwork, insurance, fuel accounts, and the 1,000 things that keep a boat legal. And that work gave me the one idea this whole story rests on. So give me 40 seconds. Everything down there looks the same at high water. Every hull in that harbor sits level and pretty at high tide. Boats worth $200,000 and boats that haven't run in 3 years, they all float the same. And from the road, you cannot tell them apart. And then the tide goes out. And you find out which ones were floating and which ones were just sitting on the bottom waiting for the water to come back. You can't argue with a tide. That's the other half of it. You don't shout at it and you don't reason with it. You just stop pretending, and you note what you see when the water's gone, and you plan accordingly. 35 years I watched that harbor drain twice a day. And I want you to hold on to that, because I didn't apply one bit of it to my own family until I was 64 years old. Alcide died 5 years before this. Heart, on the water, in October. He was 66 and he was alone in the wheelhouse, and I have made my peace with that in the only way you can, which is not really. 39 years married. We had one boy. Colin. He's 35 now, was 33 when this happened. He works in facilities management for a hospital system, which is a good job and he's good at it. He married Danica about 4 years before that dinner. And Danica's mother is Roxanne Kilgore. I need to tell you about Roxanne, because she's the engine of this whole thing, and I want to be careful about it. Roxanne is one of those women who uses sarcasm the way other people use a hammer as a tool she picked up young because it was the only one on the bench. She has never once in 9 years said a directly cruel thing to me. Not one. Everything she says is a joke, and if you object to it, you're the one who's made it awkward. That's the whole system. It's very effective, and I've watched a lot of people fold under it. I have never much cared for her, and I have always been civil, because she is my son's mother-in-law, and that's the arrangement. Now the dinner. Colin called on a Wednesday and said he and Danica wanted to take me out. There's a place on the waterfront that does the fried haddock I like, and he made a point of that, and it landed the way it was meant to. I hadn't been out to dinner with my son alone since March, and I drove because they said they'd meet me there, and then Danica texted that morning asking if I could swing by and get them since parking downtown is impossible in July. Which I did, happily. It was 12 minutes out of my way. I want that noted for later. And we walked in, and there was Roxanne, already in the booth, with a glass of wine that was clearly not her first. And Colin said, "Oh ma, I should have said." Roxanne was free. Should have said. And I sat down and said how nice. And I meant about 40% of it. Now I want to walk you through that hour properly, because everybody remembers the ending, and the ending is not the interesting part. Inside 11 minutes, she had done 3 things. She looked at my blouse, a perfectly good linen thing. I've had 4 summers, and said, "Oh, that's sweet. Is that from the shop on Congress? The one with the ladies' things?" She asked, as an aside, whether Alcide's pension had gone through all right in the end, because you hear such stories, which is not a question anybody has any business asking, and which she asked in front of a waiter. And she sent back a glass of wine and made a face at Danica about it. And through all of that, my son stirred his drink. He does that. Colin has done that since he was 19. When a room gets tense, he goes very interested in whatever's in front of him, and he waits for it to pass, the way you'd wait out weather. And Danica sat beside her mother with her wine and gave a little smile every time Roxanne landed one. Not laughing, just a small tuck at the corner of the mouth. Validation, delivered at intervals. And I kept my answers short. I asked about their new gutters. I asked about the drive up. I did everything I know how to do to move a conversation towards safe ground. But you cannot move a conversation with somebody who isn't looking for one. Roxanne wasn't there to talk. She was there to perform, and that night I was the material. If you've ever spent an evening being somebody's entertainment while everyone at the table pretends it's just chat, you already know the specific exhaustion. It isn't the insults. It's the managing. It's doing the emotional labor of keeping a room comfortable while you're the one being bled. Then the plates came out, and she leaned over her scallops and said, and this is close to word for word, I've had 4 years. It must be lovely, though, all that time. No man to look after, no real obligations. Just pottering around that big house of yours while the rest of us are still working. And I set my fork down. And I said, I keep busy, Roxanne, and the quiet's something I earned. And Danica rolled her eyes. I saw it. She didn't hide it. And Roxanne swirled that glass and said, oh, come on, you're just lonely. That's why you're always underfoot with Colin. It's a bit desperate, don't you think? Underfoot? I want to tell you what I'd done underfoot that year. I'd driven Colin to 2 colonoscopy appointments and back, because you can't drive yourself. I'd taken their dog for 11 days in February. I'd come at 7 in the morning in a snowstorm when their pipe went, because I have Alcide's tools and I know where the shutoff is on that house, because I helped them buy it. Underfoot. And Colin looked at his plate and said, Ma's not desperate, Roxanne. And I want you to hear how he said it, because this is the part that actually broke something. He said it quietly, almost under the room noise, 9 words at low volume aimed at a placemat. And Danica's hand went straight onto his forearm. Not a grab, a pat, 2 little pats, the way you'd settle a dog. And he stopped talking. Now that's the moment, not what came later. That right there. Because a son who says nothing at all, you can tell yourself he didn't hear it, or he's conflict shy, or he's tired. A son who says 9 words and gets patted quiet in front of you has told you the entire arrangement in about 4 seconds. He knows. He knows it's wrong. And he has calculated that the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of you sitting there. And I sat in that booth with my fork down and understood that my child had run that arithmetic and it had not come out in my favor. And then Danica turned to me and said, honestly, Bernadette, you take everything so seriously. She's only joking. And I said evenly, and I'm proud of the evenness. I said, an insult with a smile on it is still an insult, Danica. It's just an insult with better manners. And that's when her face changed. She put the wine down and leaned forward on her forearms and looked straight at me. And she said, if you can't handle my mother's sense of humor, you can pay the bill and leave. Now, I want to slow this all the way down, because everything in this story happens in the next 11 seconds, and I have gone over them more than I've gone over anything in my life. The table went quiet. Roxanne actually put her glass down, which I noticed, because it meant that even she thought that had gone too far and she has no floor at all. Colin's head came up for the first time in 20 minutes. And there was a couple at the next table who stopped talking. I know because the woman was still holding her fork in the air. And Danica sat there and waited. And I understood exactly what she was waiting for, because it's what I'd have done every other time in 9 years. She was waiting for me to go small, to do the face. Oh, I didn't mean anything by it. Let's not spoil dinner, I'm sorry. Tell me about the gutters. That's the move. That's the move I had made, in some version, at every single family occasion since 2016. And I sat in that booth and something in me went very quiet and very level. And I smiled at her. And I said, Danica, that's an excellent idea. And I put my hand up for the waiter. Now, she did not understand what was happening. I want to be clear about that because people assume she saw it coming. She did not. The young man came over and I handed him my card and I said, I'd like the whole table on this one, please, whenever you're ready. Don't wait on the others. And Danica actually relaxed. I watched it happen. Her shoulders came down. Because in her head, I had just done the thing I always do. I'd absorbed it, and I was paying, and the evening would go on. She thought she'd won. She thought I was buying peace. Roxanne said something to her sister on the phone. Later I heard about this months afterward. She said, she just went and paid it, like she always does. And the waiter came back with the slip and I signed it and I put my card in my wallet and I put my wallet in my bag. And then I stood up. And I want to describe this because it's the whole story. I did not make a speech. I have thought of about 11 speeches since and I didn't make any of them, and I'm glad. I put my coat over my arm. And Colin said, uncertainly, thanks for dinner, Ma. And I said, you're welcome, love. And then I said the 11 words that changed that entire family. I said, I'm driving myself home. You two came with me, so you'll want to work something out. And I walked out. Behind me, I heard a chair move and I did not turn around. And I got out onto the sidewalk into that cold air off the water, and I walked to my car, and I sat in it for a second before I started it, and my hands were absolutely steady, which surprised me. And I drove home along the cove with the windows down in July, and I did not cry and I did not shake. I made a cup of tea, and I sat on my back step, and I felt something I had not felt in 9 years of family dinners, which was nothing. No going back over it, working out what I should have said, no rehearsing an apology I hadn't decided whether to give. Just quiet. And I want to be honest about one thing, because I've had 4 years to be honest about it. I did know they'd come in my car. I want that said out loud. I did not forget. When I said that sentence in that restaurant, I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew it was going to cost them about $50 and a certain amount of standing around on a sidewalk on a Friday night. And I did it anyway. And I have never been sorry, and I'll tell you at the end why I think that's all right and also the one part of it I'd do differently. Colin rang at 8 the next morning. I was on the porch with black coffee, watching Mrs. Aubuchon walk her enormous elderly dog. And I let it ring 4 times. And I said, good morning. And he came out of the gate hard. He said, Ma, what was that? You embarrassed us. It was $41 for a ride, and Danika's been up since 5 about it. And I took a sip. And I said, good morning, Colin. I slept beautifully. Thanks for asking. And he made that noise he's made since he was 6. And he said, come on. You know she didn't mean literally leave us there. And I said, she said pay the bill and leave. I paid the bill, I left. I don't know which half she wanted me to skip. And he said, you need to apologize. To her and to Roxanne. They think you had a tantrum. A tantrum. And I sat on my own porch at 8 in the morning and thought about how remarkable it is that a woman can sit still for an hour, keep her voice down, pay for 4 dinners and walk out without one raised word and have it come back to her as a tantrum. Because that's what the word is for. That's the entire job that word does. It takes an adult's decision and refiles it as a child's outburst so you don't have to engage with it. And I said no. And he said, Ma. And I said, I didn't raise my voice once. I paid for a meal I didn't want, at a table where I was insulted 3 times before the food came, and then I removed myself. There won't be an apology. And there was a pause. And then he said, Danica says you're not welcome at the house until you say sorry. And I said, and I meant every word, that works out very well for me. Enjoy your weekend, love. And I hung up, and then I went inside and opened my laptop. Now this is the part everybody wants, so let me tell it properly and let me tell you the true thing about it, which is that it took 9 minutes. For 6 years I had been quietly carrying 2 things for those 2. When Colin went to school in 2010, I put him on my mobile account, because it was cheaper. When he married Danica in 2020, she went on it too, because she asked, and because it was another $16. And I carried their car insurance. Both vehicles. That started in 2014 when he was doing an internship and could not afford it, and it just never came off, because Alcide had set it up and Alcide was gone and I had not touched that policy since. $288 a month, the pair of it. Almost $3,500 a year. I had never mentioned either one. Not once. Not in 6 years. Hold on to that, because it's the whole point and I'll come back to it. So I logged into the carrier and I split their 2 lines off my account, and the system told me service would suspend within 24 hours unless a new payment method was added. And I clicked confirm. And then I rang my insurance agent, Dennis, who I've had since 1994, and I said I'd like to remove 2 vehicles from my policy effective immediately. And Dennis, who has known me a very long time, said, Bern, are you all right? And I said, I'm the best I've been in 5 years, Dennis. Take them off. And he did. And he emailed me the confirmation while I was still on the phone. And I sent no warning. No text. No email explaining myself. And people ask me about that, and here's my answer. An explanation is an invitation. The second I write I'm removing you from these accounts because of what happened at dinner, I have opened a negotiation, and now we're going to spend 11 days arguing about whether the reason is proportionate. I wasn't ending an argument, I was ending a subsidy. Those are different actions, and the second one doesn't require anybody's agreement. Then I went out and weeded the bed along the fence for 2 hours in the sun, and I repotted 2 things that had needed it since May, and it was the best afternoon I'd had that year. Tuesday, it landed. I knew the exact moment because Colin couldn't call me. His truck came up my street at 4:20, and he came in the front door with his own key, which he had had since 2019, and which I want you to remember. He came into my kitchen holding his phone up in the air like a man holding evidence. He said, "My phone's dead, Danika's is dead, and I've got an email from the insurance saying our coverage terminated Saturday. Did you get hacked?" And I dried my hands on the towel and leaned against the counter. And I said, "No, nothing's hacked. I took you both off my accounts." And he blinked at me. He genuinely blinked, 3 or 4 times. And he said, "You, why?" And I said, "Because you're 33, love. You've a full-time job, and so does she." And he said, "This is about the dinner." And I said, "No, the dinner just showed me what the water was doing." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Never mind." And then he said the sentence that told me everything about how those two had been living. He said, "We can't just absorb that, not out of nowhere, you could have warned us." Absorb that. And here's the thing, and this is where I want you to lean in, because this is the part that changed how I think about my whole life. He didn't say thank you for 6 years. He didn't say I didn't realize you were paying that. He said you could have warned us, which means he had known about it. Of course he'd known. He had a phone that worked and had simply stopped experiencing it as anything at all. It had become weather to him, like the water pressure, like the tide. And I looked at my son in my kitchen, and I understood, finally, at 64 years old, that generosity nobody names is not received as generosity. It's received as conditions. And that is not entirely his fault, and I'll get to that. And I said, "You have savings and you both have wages. You'll sort it." And he paced. He does that. Hand through the hair. And he said, "Danica is going to lose it when I tell her it was on purpose." And I said, "That's between you and your wife." And I said, "I've got a haddock casserole in 20 minutes, and there's plenty if you'd like to stay." And he stood there for a second, and I could see him want to, and then he said no, and he went, and he shut the door harder than he needed to. And I ate that casserole by myself, and it was very good. Wednesday, they came to the house. Both of them. Danica and Roxanne, in Roxanne's car, at 10:30 in the morning. I was reading in the front room, and I heard the car, and I looked out, and my stomach did a thing, and I want to admit that, because I have told this story as though I was made of granite, and I was not. 2 of them, coming as a pair, that's a decision somebody made in a driveway. I went to the front door, and I opened the inner door. And I left the storm door shut and latched. And I want to tell you why that mattered, because it's the single most practical thing in this whole story. That storm door is a heavy one, aluminum and glass, with a hook latch outside put on in 2003. And a latched screen door is a completely different conversation from a doorstep conversation. You are standing in your house. They are standing outside it. Nobody is coming in, and nobody has to be asked to leave. And Danica said, "Open the door, Bernadette, we need to talk." And I said, "We can talk fine like this." And Roxanne, arms folded, in sunglasses at 10:30, said, "Oh, don't be absurd. Let us in. You look ridiculous." And I said, "It's my house, Roxanne. I decide who's in it." And she made a noise. And Danica started. She said cutting off the phones and the insurance was petty. She said it was vindictive. She said I was punishing Colin because I don't like her. And she said, "You've torn this whole family apart over a joke." And I want to describe what I did because it's not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was list it. The pipe in February, the 11 days with the dog, the colonoscopies, the $288 a month for 6 years. I wanted to stand behind that screen and read the whole ledger out at those 2 women until they had to hear it. And I did not. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because it's the thing I'd most want you to take from this. The second I start listing, I've agreed to be judged. I've agreed that my right to be treated decently in a restaurant depends on how much I've done, and that the correct response to their disrespect is for me to prove I'd earned better. That's a trial, and once you're in it, even winning it means you accepted the premise. So I didn't list one thing. I said, I stopped paying for things I was never obliged to pay for. That's not punishment, that's arithmetic. And Danica said, over a joke. And I said, over the fact that you told me to leave a table in public, and nobody at it disagreed with you. And she said, that's not I didn't mean. And Roxanne cut across her, the way she does, and said, this is exactly what I said in the car. She's loving this. Some people want to be the victim. And I looked at Roxanne through that screen. And I said the only sharp thing I said in this whole story. I said, Roxanne, you've been in my son's family 9 years, and I've had you in my house for every holiday, and I have never once said an unkind word to you. And I said, not one, in 9 years. And I'd like you to sit with what that cost me because it cost me a great deal. And she opened her mouth and she did not have anything. Because that's the thing about a woman who fights entirely with jokes. Take the joke away and there's no second weapon. She had absolutely nothing to say to a plain sentence, and she stood on my step and could not find one word. And I said, have a good day, ladies. And I closed the inner door and turned the deadbolt. And I went back to my chair and picked my book up, and my hands were shaking so hard I had to put it down. 3 minutes. That's how long they stood out there, and I could hear Danica's voice going up and down, and then a car door, and then another car door, and then they went. And I sat in my own front room and cried for about 2 minutes and then stopped and made lunch. That's the truth of it. People tell this story back to me like I'm iron. I cried in a chair at 11 in the morning and then I ate a sandwich. Then it went quiet for 8 days. And in those 8 days, I did something I had not expected to do at all. I started walking around that house looking at it. 4 bedrooms. Alcide and I bought it in 1989 for a number I'd be embarrassed to tell you. Paid it off in 2011. And I hadn't been upstairs in the back 2 rooms since Christmas, except to run the taps so the traps didn't dry out. I stood in the doorway of Colin's old room, which still had his hockey pennants on the wall, and I thought about the fact that I was paying to heat a shrine. And then I thought about Thanksgiving. Because at Thanksgiving this house, my table I had come out of the kitchen with a jug of water and heard Danica in the hallway saying to her mother that when they eventually moved in, the kitchen would have to come out entirely. When they eventually moved in. Not if. Not one word about me being in it, or not in it, or where I'd be, or when. I had gone back into the kitchen and put the jug on the counter and served the meal and said nothing about it for 8 months. And standing in that back bedroom in July, I finally let myself understand what I'd heard. They were not waiting for me to need help. They were waiting for a house. So I rang Odette Bissonnette, who I know from the co-op board and who sells houses. She walked through on the Thursday. She told me the market was absurd and that this house, on this street, would go in under a week. And I signed the listing agreement at my own kitchen table on Thursday afternoon. And I want to be honest about something, because it's the most complicated feeling in this whole story. I was not doing that to hurt them. But I also cannot honestly say it played no part. Because when I signed that page, one of the things I felt right underneath the fear, and there was a great deal of fear, was a kind of lightness that came from knowing that a thing 2 people were quietly counting on had stopped existing. That's not noble. That's human. I'm not going to pretend it away. I packed for a week. I did his room first. Yearbooks, a trophy from 2005, 4 boxes of hockey cards, a guitar with 2 strings, which he bought in 2008 and never learned. I stacked all of it in the garage, neatly with his name on it in marker. And every box I taped shut, I felt lighter, and I've thought a lot about what that means about a house and a mother. The sign went in on a Tuesday. Colin was there Wednesday afternoon. He rang the bell. He had a key and he rang the bell, and I noticed that immediately. I opened the door with tape in my hand, and he was white, actually white. And he pointed at the yard and he said, "What is that?" And I said, "It's a sign, love. I'm selling." And he came into the hall and looked at 40 cardboard boxes and he said, "You can't sell. This is Ma. This is the family house. We were going to move in and help you keep it up." And I said, "I don't need it kept up. I'm buying a condo." And he got his phone out, he'd sorted a plan by then, and he rang his wife, and I could hear her before he got it near his ear. And he handed me the phone. And Danica said, "Bernadette, what are you doing? You're throwing away Colin's inheritance. You can't just sell it without discussing it with us." And I want to tell you that I stayed calm, and I did. And here's what I said. I said, "Danica, I'm 64 years old and I'm alive. There is no inheritance. There's a house that belongs to me, and I'm selling it to pay for the next 30 years of my life." And she said, "You're doing this to spite me." And I said, "I don't think about you enough to organize my finances around you." And I want to admit right now that that sentence was not kind, and I had been saving it for 4 days. And I handed the phone back and I said, "There are 4 boxes with your name on them in the garage, love. Take them today." The house sold in 5 days, over asking, to a couple with a toddler and one on the way. Moving day was a Saturday in September. I was in the empty drive with a box of cleaning things when Colin's truck came up the street. They both got out. Danica stood on the pavement with her arms crossed, looking at the house. And she said, "I honestly didn't think you'd do it." And then she said, "You're going to be very lonely in a condominium." And I looked at her. And I said, "I'd rather be alone in a place that's mine than surrounded in a place where I have to be careful." And Colin rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Do you need a hand with anything, Ma?" And I said, "No, love. The movers did it all." And then I took an envelope out of my jacket and I gave it to him. I said, "That's the new address. You're welcome any time, but ring first, I mean that. Not as a punishment. I've things on now and I'm not always in." And then I looked at Danica and I said, "And you're welcome too." And she looked up, because she had not expected that. Neither had he. And I said, "Your mother isn't. Not ever. And I want that clear now rather than at Christmas." And Danica said, "You can't tell me my mother." And Colin said, "Danica, stop." 1 word and then 2. And I have to tell you what that did to me, because I nearly dropped the box. 33 years, and I had never once heard my son end something. Not one time. He has spent his entire life waiting for weather to pass. And he stood on a pavement in front of an empty house and told his wife to stop, and she did. And I got in my car and backed out and gave them a wave. And I did not look in the mirror, and I have never once regretted it. The condo's on the 2nd floor with a little balcony that gets the morning. 2 bedrooms, one's mine, one's got a chair and a lamp and about 400 books in it. There is no spare bed. That was deliberate, and I'd recommend it. I grow tomatoes and basil in pots out there, and they're better than anything I ever managed in that big garden, which nobody warned me about. Colin comes now, roughly monthly. He came alone in November and again in February, and in April he came and sat on that balcony and told me they'd been having a bad stretch, that since everything came off my accounts, they'd had to look at their actual numbers for the first time in 6 years and had not liked what they found. And I did not gloat, and I did not offer $1. I poured him a coffee and I let him talk for an hour, which turns out to be the hardest thing a mother can do. Danica came at Easter, on her own, which I didn't expect, and she stood in my little kitchen and she was not sorry. Exactly, she has never used the word, but she said one thing that has kept me thinking for 2 years. She said, "You know she does it to me too." And I said, "I know." And she said, "She's done it to me since I was 9 years old. And the way you survive it is you get on her side. You laugh, and then it's somebody else's turn." And she looked out the window and she said, "That night, when she started on you, I did what I've done my whole life. I got on her side so it wouldn't be me." And then she said, "That's not an excuse." And I said, "No, it isn't." And she said, "I know. And here's what I've done with that in the 2 years since." Roxanne Kilgore was widowed at 31 with a 4-year-old and nothing at all. She cleaned rooms at a motel on Route 1 for 11 years and raised that girl on it. And sarcasm is what she built instead of money. It's the only weapon that's free. It's what you get when you spend 20 years in rooms where you're the one being looked down on and you cannot afford to leave any of them. And then she looks across a table at me, a widow with a paid-off house and a husband's pension and a boat business behind her, and she sees a woman who got the version of widowhood that was never on offer to her. That is not an excuse. She asked about my dead husband's pension in front of a waiter, and she called me desperate to my face, and she has never once apologized. But it is a reason, and understanding it cost me nothing. And it means that when I hear she's had a bad year, I feel something other than satisfaction, and I'd rather be that than the other thing. Now, here's what all this taught me, and it isn't set boundaries, which is a phrase I have come to genuinely dislike. Here's the real one. I paid for those phones and that insurance for 6 years, and I never said one word about it. Not once. Not a mention, not a nudge, not a by the way, that's about $300 a month and I'm glad to do it. And I thought that was class. I genuinely did. I thought that was how you give quietly, without keeping score, the way Alcide's mother did it. It was not class. It was cowardice with good manners on it. Because unnamed help is not received as help, it becomes furniture. It becomes the water pressure. And then when it goes, the person doesn't feel a gift withdrawn, they feel an attack, and they're not entirely wrong to, because nobody ever told them it was a gift. Every hull in that harbor looks the same at high water. I kept the water high for 6 years and never said so, and then acted wounded that nobody could tell which boat was floating. That's mine. I own that entirely. So here's the specific thing I'd ask you to do, and it takes about 11 minutes and one uncomfortable sentence. Go and find every recurring thing you pay for that another adult uses. The phone line, the insurance, the subscription, the storage unit, the policy you set up in 2014 and haven't looked at since. Write down the monthly figure. And then this is the part, say it out loud to them. Once. Not as a complaint and not as a bill. I want you to know I pay this. It's about this much. And I'm glad to. I just want it to be a thing we both know about rather than a thing that happens. That's it. It'll be awkward for 9 seconds. And it does 2 things at once. It gives them the chance to be grateful, which unnamed help steals from them. And it means that if you ever do stop, you're ending something they knew existed instead of detonating something they thought was the weather. I never gave my son that chance. 6 years. And when I finally spoke, the only sentence available to me was a hard one. And here's the question I'd want you to sit with tonight. What are you carrying quietly, and who exactly are you protecting by not mentioning it? Because I told myself I was protecting Colin's pride. I was protecting myself from a conversation, and I called it grace, and I dressed it up in Alcide's mother's manners for 6 years. I go down to Willard on Wednesday mornings now with 2 other women I met through the library. We walk about 1.5 miles and complain about our knees. And once a month or so, at low tide, I go out and stand on the cove path and look at the mud. Boats sitting over on their sides in it, ones that looked perfectly fine at 9 that morning. You can't argue with a tide, you just wait, and then you look, and then you plan accordingly. Now I want to hear from you, and I want the honest answer, not the polite one. If you think I did right leaving them at that restaurant, comment 1. If you think a woman can pay the bill and walk out with her head up and still not have any business stranding 2 people downtown on a Friday night, and my sister has made that argument to me twice, and it is not a bad one, comment 2. That's the one thing in this story I genuinely do differently. I'd have handed Colin $20 on my way past. It would have cost me nothing, and it would have taken the one weapon they had. And if you think the failure in all of this happened years earlier when a woman paid $300 a month for 6 years and never once said so out loud, comment 3, that's the one I'd pick. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every one. There's something about an old bookkeeper in Maine knowing somebody's hearing this at 6 in the morning half a world away that I can't quite put into words. And if you've ever sat at a table being somebody's entertainment while everybody else pretended it was just chat say so down below, you don't need to give a single detail. Somebody scrolling past tonight has a dinner on Saturday they're already dreading, and it would help them to know it can go another way. If you want more of these, subscribe and stay with me a while. It's ordinary people, one bad evening, and what they turned out to be made of when it came. I'd be glad to have you here. 35 years I watched a harbor empty twice a day. Every boat floats at high water. You only find out what's underneath when it goes out, and it always goes out. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Maine to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.